Captain Marcus Wellington had served the royal family for 15 years, yet tonight felt different. The ancient stone corridors of the palace seemed to whisper secrets as he made his evening rounds. His polished boots echoed against the marble floors, each step carrying the weight of traditions that stretched back centuries. The palace had always been a place of mystery, but lately something had changed. The Queen's private meetings had become more frequent, lasting deep into the night. Foreign dignitaries arrived through hidden entrances, their faces grave with concern. Marcus had noticed the increased security measures. The way conversations stopped when he entered rooms, the nervous glances exchanged between senior staff members, as head of the Queen's personal guard. Marcus had access to areas most people could never imagine. He knew about the secret passages that connected the royal chambers, the hidden rooms where centuries of royal documents were stored, and the underground tunnels that could evacuate the family in times of crisis. But even with his high-level clearance, there were doors that remained locked to him, conversations that ceased when he approached. Tonight, as he patrolled the East Wing, Marcus heard voices coming from the Queen's private study. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, unusual for such late hours. Through the narrow gap, he could see the Queen sitting across from a man he didn't recognize. The stranger wore an expensive suit but carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to power. Papers were scattered across the mahogany desk between them. The Queen's voice was barely above a whisper, but Marcus caught fragments of their conversation. Words like inheritance, bloodline, and public knowledge drifted through the air. The stranger leaned forward, his face serious as he spoke about documents that could change everything and revelations that would shake the monarchy to its core. Marcus felt his heart racing. In all his years of service, he had never eavesdropped on private royal conversations. His training had taught him to be invisible, to see and hear nothing unless specifically required for security purposes. But something about this meeting felt different. More significant than the usual political discussions or family matters, the palace had been his second home. Since he joined the Royal Guard as a young man, he remembered his first day overwhelmed by the grandeur and history surrounding him. Senior guards had taught him that loyalty meant silence, that protecting the royal family sometimes meant protecting their secrets even from other family members. Over the years, he had witnessed private moments, family arguments, and personal struggles that would fascinate the public but would never leave his lips. But this felt bigger than family drama or political maneuvering. The tension in the Queen's voice, the way she kept glancing toward the door, the stranger's insistence that time was running out, all of it suggested something that could affect not just the royal family, but the entire nation. As Marcus continued his patrol, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled upon something that would change everything he thought he knew about the monarchy. The palace, with its centuries of traditions and carefully guarded secrets, suddenly felt less like a symbol of stability and more like a house of cards that could collapse with the wrong revelation. His radio crackled to life, calling him to the main gate where a late-night delivery was arriving. As he walked through the dimly lit corridors, Marcus found himself looking at the portraits of past monarchs with new eyes. Their painted faces seemed to watch him as if they too were keeping secrets that transcended generations. The delivery turned out to be a courier with an urgent package for the Queen, marked with official seals from various government departments. The young courier seemed nervous, repeatedly checking his watch and glancing around as if expecting to be followed. Marcus signed for the package, noting its unusual weight and the multiple security seals that covered it. Back in the palace, Marcus delivered the package to the Queen's secretary, who immediately locked it in a secure cabinet rather than placing it with the regular correspondence. The secretary, usually chatty and friendly, barely acknowledged Marcus's presence, her focus entirely on the mysterious package. As the night wore on, Marcus noticed other unusual activities. Kitchen staff were preparing food for more people than usual, despite no official guests being announced. Additional security personnel had been quietly stationed at various points throughout the palace, their presence subtle but unmistakable to someone with Marcus's training. The maintenance staff was also working later than usual, checking and double-checking security systems, communication networks, and the palace's extensive surveillance equipment. When Marcus asked about the extra activity, he was told it was routine maintenance. But the nervous expressions on their faces suggested otherwise. By dawn, as Marcus completed his shift, he realized that whatever was happening behind the palace, Gates was bigger than he had initially thought. Secrets being protected weren't just family matters or political strategies. They were something that could fundamentally change how the public viewed the monarchy itself. Walking to his quarters, in the staff wing, Marcus passed the palace gardens where groundskeepers were already at work. Even they seemed different today, more focused, more serious than usual. It was as if the entire palace staff sensed that something significant was about to happen. Even if they didn't know exactly what, as he finally reached his room, Marcus looked back at the palace's imposing silhouette against the morning sky. For 15 years, he had been proud to serve and protect this institution. But now, he wondered if the very foundations of what he had sworn to protect were built on secrets that the public had a right to know. The changing times had brought new challenges to the monarchy. Social media made it harder to control information. Investigative journalists were more persistent than ever, and the younger generation demanded transparency in ways that previous generations never had. Perhaps whatever was happening now was the monarchy's attempt to get ahead of revelations that were inevitable. Marcus closed his door, but sleep wouldn't come easily. The fragments of conversation he had overheard, the mysterious meetings, the increased security, all of it pointed to secrets that had been hidden for decades, possibly centuries, finally coming to light. Dr. Sarah Chen had worked as the royal family's private historian for 8 years, but she had never been asked to research something quite like this. The Queen's personal secretary had summoned her to a meeting that morning, requesting her to investigate specific bloodlines and inheritance laws dating back to the 18th century. The urgency in the secretary's voice had been unmistakable. Sarah's office in the palace archives was filled with centuries of documents, photographs, and records that told the story of the royal family. Most of her work involved preparing historical context for official speeches or verifying facts for authorized biographies. But this request was different. She had been asked to trace genetic lineages and examine documents that had been sealed for over 200 years. The archive room where these ancient documents were stored required special permission to access. Sarah had only been there twice before, and both times had been for minor research projects. Today, accompanied by the head librarian, she descended into the underground vaults where the most sensitive royal documents were, kept under climate-controlled conditions. The boxers. She was directed to examine bore the seals of King George III and had never been digitized or cataloged in the modern system. As Sarah carefully opened the first box, she found handwritten letters, official declarations, and birth certificates that seemed to tell a story very different from the official royal history she knew. Among the documents, she discovered correspondence between royal advisors discussing a situation that needed to be managed carefully to preserve the crown's legitimacy. The letters were written in the formal language of the era, but their meaning was clear. There had been questions about the rightful heir to the throne that had been deliberately suppressed. Sarah's hands trembled as she photographed each document. Her training as a historian had taught her to remain objective, but the implications of what she was reading were staggering. According to these papers, there had been a child born to the royal family who had been officially recorded as stillborn. But private correspondence suggested the child had actually survived and been secretly placed with a noble family. The more she read, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. There appeared to be a pattern of carefully managed adjustments to the royal bloodline over several generations. Children who didn't fit the desired succession were quietly removed from official records. Marriages were arranged to strengthen political alliances rather than follow natural inheritance, and inconvenient truths were buried in vaults like the one where Sarah now sat, as she worked through the afternoon. Sarah began to understand why these documents had remained sealed. For so long, the revelations contained within them didn't just challenge the current royal family's claim to the throne. They suggested that the entire modern monarchy was built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies. Her phone buzzed with a message from the Queen's secretary asking for a preliminary report by evening. Sarah realized she was being asked to participate in something that went far beyond historical research. These weren't just academic curiosities. They were potentially explosive secrets that could destabilize the entire constitutional monarchy. The documents revealed that during the 1780s, political pressures had forced the royal advisors to make decisions about succession that prioritized stability over legitimacy. A legitimate heir had been deemed unsuitable due to political affiliations and mental health concerns. Rather than risk a constitutional crisis, the succession had been quietly redirected to a more manageable candidate. Sarah found detailed records of payments made to families who had agreed to raise royal children in secret. Legal documents that had been backdated to cover up inconvenient births and correspondence with foreign monarchs who had been asked to support the official version of events in exchange for political favors. What disturbed Sarah most was the realization that some of these practices had continued well into the 20th century. Documents from the 1930s and 1940s showed that even in more modern times, the royal family had been willing to manipulate official records when circumstances demanded it. As evening approached, Sarah faced an impossible decision. As a historian, she was committed to truth and accuracy. But as an employee of the royal household, she had signed confidentiality agreements that legally bound her to protect royal secrets. The documents she had uncovered would fascinate historians and constitutional scholars, but they would also devastate public confidence in the monarchy. She thought about Captain Wellington, whom she had seen earlier that day looking unusually tense. Other palace staff members seemed on edge, as if everyone sensed that something significant was happening, but no one was willing to discuss it openly. The atmosphere in the palace had become charged with secrets and whispered conversations. Sarah's research had also uncovered references to living descendants of the hidden royal bloodlines, according to the documents. There were people alive today who had stronger claims to the throne than the current royal family, but they had no idea of their true heritage. These descendants had been living ordinary lives, completely unaware that their great-great-grandparents had been secretly connected to the crown. As she prepared her preliminary report, Sarah struggled with how much to reveal. The Queen's secretary had asked for facts, but Sarah realized that some facts were too dangerous to put in writing. The documents suggested that foreign governments had been involved in covering up these royal secrets, and that international treaties had been signed. Based on false information about the British royal succession, the implications extended far beyond Britain's borders. Commonwealth countries that recognized the British monarch as their head of state, other European royal families that had intermarried with the British royals, and even the Church of England, which was headed by the monarch, could all be affected. By these revelations, Sarah's computer screen displayed her half-finished report as she struggled with the weight of what she had discovered. The truth she had uncovered was too big for one person to bear, yet too dangerous to share with anyone else. She understood now why these documents had been sealed for so long, and why the Queen's advisors were working frantically to determine how to handle information that could change the course of history. Looking at the clock, Sarah realized she had less than an hour to submit her report. The decision she made in the next few minutes would either help preserve centuries of carefully maintained royal stability or set in motion events that could bring down the monarchy itself. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders as she stared at the documents spread across her desk, each one containing secrets that powerful people had gone to great lengths to hide. James Morrison had been working as a palace maintenance technician for 12 years, and he prided himself on knowing every hidden corner of the massive building. His job required him to access areas that most staff members never saw, including the network of service tunnels, electrical conduits, and mechanical rooms that kept the palace functioning. This morning, James had been called to investigate a problem with the communication system in one of the restricted areas. As he crawled through a narrow maintenance tunnel beneath the Queen's private offices, he heard voices coming through the ventilation system above him. The conversation was muffled, but certain words came through clearly enough to make him stop and listen. James recognized the Queen's voice immediately, but the other speakers were unfamiliar. They were discussing something about bloodline verification and DNA testing with an urgency that made James forget about the electrical problem he was supposed to fix. Through the metal grating above him, he could hear papers rustling and what sounded like heated debate. One of the unknown voices mentioned the Morrison family, and James felt his blood run cold. Morrison was his surname, but it was common enough that it might be a coincidence. However, when the speaker continued with details about the Yorkshire branch and records from 1847, James realized they were talking about his family history. His grandmother had always told stories about their family having connections to important people in the past, but James had dismissed these as the romanticized tales that many working-class families invented to make their history seem more interesting. His great-great-grandfather had supposedly worked for a wealthy family in Yorkshire, and there had always been vague mentions of special circumstances surrounding his employment. As James listened, frozen in the cramped tunnel, he heard the Queen's voice again, this time clearer. She was saying something about 3 families who need to be contacted, genetic testing to confirm what the documents suggest. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable, and James began to understand that whatever they were discussing wasn't just historical curiosity. The conversation moved to discussion of legal implications and constitutional law. James heard phrases like legitimate succession, hidden heirs, and public disclosure. It became clear that the royal family was dealing with information that could challenge their right to the throne. And somehow, James's family was connected to this centuries-old secret. When the voices finally faded and James heard doors closing above him, he remained motionless in the tunnel for several more minutes. His mind was racing with possibilities and questions. Could his family really have some connection to the royal bloodline? Is that why his great-great-grandfather had left Yorkshire so suddenly, according to family stories? James had grown up in a modest working-class family. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a seamstress. The idea that they might have royal blood seemed absurd, yet he couldn't ignore what he had just overheard. The specificity of the details, the obvious importance of the discussion, and the mention of his exact family name and location couldn't be mere coincidence. Over the next few hours, James found it impossible to concentrate on his work. He kept thinking about his grandmother's stories, which he now recalled with new interest. She had mentioned that their ancestor had been given a new life by his employers and had received ongoing support that had helped establish the family. In their new location, during his lunch break, James called his elderly aunt, his grandmother's last surviving daughter, and asked her about the old family stories. His aunt was initially reluctant to discuss the past, saying that some things are better left buried. But eventually she shared details that James had never heard before. According to his aunt, her great-great-grandfather had been involved in sensitive work for a noble family and had been rewarded with property and money that seemed far beyond what a typical servant would receive. There had been documents and papers that were kept in the family for generations, but these had been lost in a house fire in the 1960s. His aunt mentioned that there had always been speculation within the family about the true nature of their ancestors' relationship with his employers. James's aunt also revealed that several members of their family over the generations had received unexpected financial support during difficult times. Anonymous payments had helped pay for education, medical expenses, and property purchases. The family had always assumed they had a distant, wealthy relative looking out for them, but no one had ever been able to identify this benefactor. As James returned to work, he began to see the palace differently. Instead of just being a historic building where he happened to work, it now felt like a place where his own family history might be hidden. He found himself paying attention to portraits and family trees that he had previously ignored, wondering if somewhere among all those painted faces was an ancestor he had never known about. The rest of his shift was spent in areas where he hoped to overhear more conversations, but the palace had returned to its usual quiet efficiency. However, James noticed that several senior staff members seemed more tense than usual, and there were visitors he didn't recognize being escorted through areas that were normally off-limits to outsiders. That evening, James went home to his smallest apartment and began searching through old family photographs and documents. Among his grandmother's belongings, she had inherited but never thoroughly examined, he found a few items that now seemed significant. There was an old locket with an inscription he couldn't read, some formal-looking papers written in language that seemed unusually legal for family documents, and a photograph of his great-great-grandfather that showed him wearing clothing that seemed too expensive for a typical working man of that era. James also found an address in Yorkshire that his grandmother had written down years ago, along with a note saying the old place where it all began. He had never thought to investigate this address before, but now it seemed like it might hold answers to questions he was only beginning to understand the more James thought about what he had overheard, the more he realized that his life might be about to change dramatically. If the royal family was actively investigating his bloodline, it meant that whatever connection existed was significant enough to potentially affect the monarchy itself. As he lay in bed that night, James wondered if there were other families like his, ordinary people living normal lives while being completely unaware that they carried secrets that could reshape British history. The conversation he had overheard suggested there were at least 2 other families involved, meaning he wasn't alone in this strange situation. James realized that tomorrow he would return to work at the palace with a completely different perspective. Instead of just being a maintenance worker, he might be someone whose very existence posed a challenge to centuries of royal tradition. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Eleanor Whitfield had always known she was different from other children, but she had never understood why. Growing up in a comfortable middle-class family in Surrey, she had enjoyed advantages that seemed unusual for their modest circumstances. Private school fees had been mysteriously covered by anonymous scholarships. Family medical expenses had been paid by unnamed benefactors, and their family home had been purchased with the help of an interest-free loan from a source her parents never clearly explained. Now, at 32 years old and working as a museum curator, Eleanor received a phone call that would change everything she thought she knew about her identity. The caller identified himself as a representative of the royal household and requested an urgent meeting to discuss matters of historical significance related to your family lineage. Eleanor's first instinct was to assume it was some kind of scam or prank call. However, the caller provided details about her family history that would have been impossible for an outsider to know. He mentioned her great-grandmother's maiden name, the specific village in Scotland where her ancestors had lived, and even the name of the private benefactor who had supported her family for generations, without ever revealing their identity. The meeting was arranged for the following day at a discreet location in central London, not at the palace itself. Eleanor was told to bring any family documents or photographs she might have, particularly anything dating back to the 19th century. The mysterious nature of the request filled her with both curiosity and apprehension. Eleanor spent the evening going through her. Her grandmother had been a meticulous record keeper, and there were boxes of documents that Eleanor had inherited but never thoroughly examined. Among these papers, she found things that now seemed significant in light of the mysterious phone call. There were formal letters written on expensive stationery, legal documents that seemed unusually complex for a working-class family, and photographs of her ancestors wearing clothing that appeared too costly for their supposed social status. One photograph in particular caught her attention. It showed her great-great-grandmother at what appeared to be a formal gathering, surrounded by people whose elegant dress and refined posture suggested they were from the upper classes. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the specified address to find herself in an elegant townhouse. It clearly served as some kind of government office. She was greeted by a well-dressed woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson, representative of the royal household's private affairs department. Mrs. Patterson led Eleanor to a comfortable sitting room where tea had been prepared. The atmosphere was formal, but not unfriendly, and Eleanor began to relax slightly. However, her comfort vanished when Mrs. Patterson began explaining the reason for their meeting. According to Mrs. Patterson, recent research into royal genealogy had uncovered evidence suggesting that Eleanor's family line had a direct connection to the British royal family dating back to the late 18th century. The connection had been deliberately hidden for political reasons, but documents had recently been discovered that proved the relationship existed. Eleanor listened in stunned silence as Mrs. Patterson explained that her great-great-great-grandmother had been born into the royal family, but had been secretly placed with another family due to circumstances that made her presence at court inconvenient. This ancestor had been officially recorded as having died in infancy, but she had actually lived a full life under an assumed identity. The implications of this revelation were staggering. If the documents were authentic, Eleanor had a legitimate claim to be in the line of succession to the British throne. More importantly, her claim might actually be stronger than that of the current royal family, since her bloodline represented a more direct path of inheritance. Mrs. Patterson showed Eleanor copies of historical documents, birth certificates, and correspondence that seemed to support these extraordinary claims. The papers were clearly old and appeared authentic, with official seals and signatures that looked genuine to Eleanor's trained eye as a museum curator. However, Mrs. Patterson was quick to explain that the royal household was not seeking to publicize this information or to challenge the current succession. Instead, they were hoping to work with Eleanor to find a way to manage the situation that would protect both her privacy and the stability of the monarchy. Eleanor's mind was reeling. The comfortable middle-class life she had always known suddenly made sense in a new way. The mysterious financial support her family had received over generations, the educational opportunities that had seemed to appear from nowhere, the way doors had always seemed to open for her family, all of it could be explained if they had been secretly supported by the royal household. Mrs. Patterson explained that Eleanor wasn't the only person in this situation. There were at least 2 other families who had similar connections to the royal bloodline, and all of them were being contacted discreetly to discuss how to handle these sensitive revelations. The conversation turned to practical matters. Eleanor was asked whether she had any interest in pursuing her theoretical claim to royal status, and she was warned about the media attention and public scrutiny that would inevitably follow if these connections became public knowledge. Eleanor found herself facing an impossible choice. She could embrace her newfound royal heritage and potentially change the course of British history, or she could agree to keep the secret and continue living her comfortable but ordinary life. Both options came with enormous consequences. Mrs. Patterson also revealed that DNA testing would be necessary to confirm the documentary evidence. If Eleanor agreed to participate, genetic analysis would either prove or disprove the connection once and for all. However, the results of such testing could never be completely contained, and there was always a risk that the information could eventually become public. As the meeting concluded, Eleanor was given time to consider her options. She was provided with contact information for legal advisors who specialized in constitutional law and royal succession, as well as security consultants who could help protect her privacy. If she chose to pursue the matter further, walking home through London's busy streets, Eleanor felt as though she was living in a dream or a historical novel. The ordinary world around her seemed surreal now that she knew she might have royal blood flowing through her veins. Every person she passed on the street might someday bow to her if the truth ever came out. That evening, Eleanor called her elderly mother to share the extraordinary news. Her mother's reaction was not surprise, but rather a kind of resigned acceptance. She admitted that she had always suspected there were family secrets being kept from the younger generations, and she had wondered about the anonymous support they had always received. Eleanor's mother revealed that her own grandmother had once mentioned being told to never ask questions about the family's good fortune and to be grateful for opportunities, without seeking to understand where they came from. It seemed that each generation had been given just enough information to accept their circumstances without pushing for deeper explanations. As Eleanor prepared for bed, she realized that her life would never be the same, regardless of what decision she made. The knowledge of her potential royal heritage was a burden as much as it was an opportunity, and she would have to live with the weight of this secret even if she chose never to act on it. The crisis meeting in the Queen's private chambers brought together the most trusted advisors in the royal household. Captain Marcus Wellington stood at attention near the door, his usual post during sensitive discussions, while Dr. Sarah Chen sat at the large conference table with her research files spread before her. The atmosphere in the room was tense, with everyone present understanding that they were dealing with information that could fundamentally alter the British monarchy. Lord Pemberton, the Queen's private secretary, began the meeting by outlining the scope of what they had discovered. The historical documents uncovered by Dr. Chen had revealed not one, but multiple instances over the past 2 centuries where the royal succession had been manipulated for political convenience. The current royal family's claim to the throne was legally questionable, and there were at least 3 living individuals with potentially stronger claims to the crown. The Queen listened in silence as Lord Pemberton detailed each case. Eleanor Whitfield's connection through her great-great-great-grandmother represented the most direct challenge to the current succession. James Morrison's family had been secretly supported for generations because his ancestor had been an illegitimate, a royal child who had been officially erased from records. A third family, the Hartwell family from Scotland, had similar connections that had been recently verified through DNA testing. Dr. Chen presented her findings with clinical precision, but Marcus could see the emotional toll this research had taken on her. As a historian, she had always believed in the importance of truth, but the truths she had uncovered threatened to destroy an institution that millions of people revered and depended upon for stability. The Queen finally spoke, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were discussing. She had been aware that there were irregularities in the family history, passed down through private conversations between monarchs, but she had never imagined the full extent of the deceptions that had been maintained for centuries. Lord Pemberton explained that foreign intelligence services had begun making inquiries about British royal succession, suggesting that other governments were aware of the potential vulnerabilities in the monarchy's legitimacy. There were concerns that hostile nations might attempt to exploit this information to destabilize Britain's government in its relationships with Commonwealth countries. The discussion turned to possible responses to the crisis. One option was to quietly acknowledge the historical irregularities and begin a gradual transition that would eventually recognize the legitimate heirs. However, this approach would require years of careful management and would inevitably become public, potentially causing constitutional chaos. Another option was to maintain the current situation by ensuring the silence of the affected families through continued financial support and legal agreements. This had worked for generations, but the modern world made it increasingly difficult to keep such secrets indefinitely. Marcus found himself thinking about James Morrison, the maintenance worker who had no idea that powerful people were debating his future in rooms he would never be allowed to enter. The irony that James worked in the very palace where his royal heritage was being discussed was not lost on Marcus. Dr. Chen raised concerns about the ethical implications of continuing to hide information that belonged to the British people. She argued that constitutional monarchy was based on the consent of the governed, and that consent was meaningless if it was based on false information about the monarch's legitimacy. The Queen's legal advisor, an elderly man who had served the royal family for 40 years, outlined the constitutional implications of various courses of action. If the information became public and the current royal family's legitimacy was successfully challenged, it could trigger a constitutional crisis that might result in the abolition of the monarchy. Altogether, the meeting was interrupted by an urgent message from the palace's head of security. Investigative journalists from several major newspapers had been making inquiries about royal genealogy and historical records. Social media had begun buzzing with rumors about hidden royal secrets, and foreign news outlets were starting to pick up the story. Lord Pemberton's face went pale as he read the security report. Someone had leaked information about the ongoing investigation, and they now had very little time before the story broke publicly. The careful, deliberate approach they had been planning was no longer possible. The Queen stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. For several minutes, she remained silent while her advisors waited anxiously. When she finally turned back to the room, her expression was resolute. She announced that they would take immediate action to control the narrative before it spiraled out of their influence. The 3 families with legitimate claims would be contacted immediately and offered full disclosure about their heritage, along with choices about how they wanted to proceed. Dr. Chen was tasked with preparing a complete historical report that would be released to the public, acknowledging the irregularities in royal succession, while emphasizing the stability and continuity that the current monarchy had provided. The report would present the revelations as historical curiosities rather than challenges to current legitimacy. Captain Marcus was given responsibility for coordinating security for the three families, who would likely face intense media attention. Once their stories became public, the royal household would provide them with protection and legal support regardless of what decisions they made about their newfound royal connections. Lord Pemberton would begin reaching out to Commonwealth countries and other constitutional monarchies to prepare them for the revelations and to minimize diplomatic disruptions. The goal was to present a unified response that emphasized continuity rather than crisis. The Queen also made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. She announced that she would personally meet with Eleanor Whitfield, James Morrison, and the Scottish family to offer them choices about their futures. Rather than trying to buy their silence or manipulate them into compliance, she would treat them as equals and allow them to make informed decisions about their royal heritage. As the meeting concluded, Marcus realized that the palace would never be the same. The secrets that had protected the monarchy for centuries were about to be exposed, and no one could predict how the British people would react to learning that their royal family's right to rule was built on carefully constructed lies. The irony was that in trying to preserve the monarchy by hiding uncomfortable truths, previous generations of royal advisors had created a situation that now threatened to destroy it entirely. The very secrets that had been kept to protect the crown might ultimately be what brought it down. As the advisors filed out of the room, each carrying enormous responsibilities for managing the crisis, Marcus remained at his post. Alone at the window, looking out at the gardens where tourists gathered every day to catch a glimpse of royal life. Soon, those same people would learn that the institution they admired was far more complicated and morally ambiguous than they had ever imagined. 6 months after the revelations first came to light, the British monarchy had survived its greatest constitutional crisis in centuries, but it had emerged fundamentally changed. The palace gates that had once hidden centuries of secrets now opened to a new era of transparency and accountability that no one could have predicted. Eleanor Whitfield had made the decision that surprised everyone, including herself. When offered the choice between pursuing her legitimate claim to the throne and maintaining her private life, she had chosen a middle path that no one had anticipated. Eleanor accepted recognition of her royal heritage, but declined to challenge the current succession. Instead, she negotiated for the establishment of a new foundation that would support historical research and education about the true complexity of British royal history. The Eleanor Whitfield Foundation became a model for how modern monarchies could acknowledge their complicated pasts while building more honest relationships with their people. Eleanor herself became a respected voice for constitutional reform, using her unique position to advocate for greater transparency in royal affairs while respecting the need for some level of privacy and dignity for the royal family. James Morrison's journey had been more dramatic. The revelation of his royal heritage had initially overwhelmed him, and he had struggled with the decision about whether to embrace his newfound status or continue his simple life as a palace maintenance worker. After months of consultation with legal experts and historians, James chose to accept a formal acknowledgement of his royal blood while remaining in his current job. The palace created a new position for James as keeper of hidden histories, giving him responsibility for maintaining and preserving the secret passages, hidden rooms, and forgotten spaces that had played such an important role in royal history. His intimate knowledge of the palace's physical structure, combined with his personal connection to its hidden past, made him uniquely qualified for this role. James's new position came with a modest increase in salary and living quarters within the palace itself, but more importantly, it gave him a sense of purpose and belonging that he had never experienced before. He became a bridge between the palace's working staff and its royal inhabitants, helping to create a more inclusive atmosphere within the royal household. The Scottish family, the Hartwells, had chosen the most radical path of all. After learning about their royal connections, they had decided to use their newfound status to advocate for Scottish independence and constitutional reform. Their claim to royal heritage had given them a platform to argue that Scotland deserved representation in discussions about the future of the monarchy, and they had become prominent voices in the movement for a more federal approach to the United Kingdom's constitutional structure. Dr. Sarah Chen had published her complete historical research in a book that became an international bestseller. The Hidden Crown: Secret Histories of the British Monarchy presented the full scope of the discoveries, in accessible language that helped the public understand the complex realities behind centuries of royal tradition. Rather than destroying public faith in the monarchy, the book had actually increased respect for the institution by showing how it had evolved and adapted to changing circumstances throughout history. Sarah's work had also inspired similar investigations. In other constitutional monarchies around the world, European royal families began conducting their own genealogical reviews, and several had discovered similar irregularities in their succession histories. The British example of handling these revelations with transparency rather than denial became a model for other nations facing similar challenges. Captain Marcus Wellington had been promoted to head the newly created Department of Royal Transparency, a position that would have been unthinkable under the old system of absolute secrecy. His job now involved managing the balance between necessary privacy for the royal family and the public's right to understand the institution they supported with their taxes and loyalty. Marcus found his new role both challenging and rewarding. Instead of protecting secrets, he was now responsible for helping decide which information should be shared with the public, and how to present it in ways that educated rather than sensationalized. The skills he had developed as a security officer proved surprisingly useful in managing information security and media relations. The Queen herself had emerged from the crisis with her popularity higher than it had been in decades. Her decision to meet personally with each of the affected families and to support full disclosure of the historical irregularities had earned her widespread public admiration. Opinion polls showed that the British people respected her honesty and courage in facing uncomfortable truths about her family's past. The monarchy's response to the crisis had also strengthened its relationships with Commonwealth countries. Rather than seeing the revelations as evidence of British deception, most Commonwealth leaders praised the transparency and accountability that the royal household had demonstrated. Several countries that had been considering becoming republics decided to maintain their ties to the British crown, citing the reformed monarchy's commitment to honesty and democratic values. The palace itself had been transformed by the events. Areas that had been closed to the public for centuries were now included in expanded tours that told the complete story of royal history, including its less glamorous chapters. The secret passages that James Morrison now maintained had become popular attractions that helped visitors understand the real complexity of royal life throughout history. New protocols had been established for handling historical documents and genealogical research. Instead of sealing inconvenient discoveries in underground vaults, the royal archives now operated with academic transparency, allowing qualified historians to access materials that had previously been completely restricted. The media landscape around the royal family had also evolved. Instead of the traditional approach of either fawning coverage or scandal-mongering, a new generation of royal correspondents had emerged who focused on substantive analysis of the monarchy's role in modern democracy. The revelations had created an appetite for serious discussion about constitutional issues rather than just celebrity gossip about royal lives. Public education about the monarchy had been revolutionized as well. Schools now taught more comprehensive curricula about royal history that included discussion of the political and social pressures that had shaped succession decisions over the centuries. Young people developed a more sophisticated understanding of how democratic institutions evolved, adapted to changing circumstances. The crisis had also sparked broader conversations about truth and transparency in other British institutions. Parliament, the judiciary, even private corporations found themselves under increased pressure to be more open about their histories and decision-making processes. The royal family's example of confronting uncomfortable truths set a new standard for institutional accountability. As Marcus stood in the same corridor where he had first overheard the conversation that started everything, he reflected on how completely the palace had been transformed. The walls that had once hidden centuries of secrets now displayed exhibits that told the full story of royal history, including the revelations that had initially seemed so threatening. The monarchy had not only survived the exposure of its hidden secrets, but had actually been strengthened by the experience. By choosing transparency over concealment, honesty over tradition, and accountability over privilege, the royal family had earned a new kind of legitimacy. It was based on trust rather than mystery. The gates of the palace still protected the royal family's privacy and security, but they no longer shielded an institution built on hidden lies. Instead, they guarded a monarchy that had proven it could face the truth about its past and build a more honest relationship with the people it served. The secrets that had once threatened to destroy the crown had ultimately helped create a stronger, more democratic, and more respected royal institution for the modern age.